So again, just enter into a meditative state as is your own tradition, your own style. And now I invite you to consider specific, unique moments when you had an intuitive insight. Just go back, scan back over your life. You could go back to childhood if you want. And just scan back and notice, recollect these moments, these unique moments. Go in another room or find a space and move with it, do authentic movement with it. But relive that experience as best you can recollect with all your senses. Smell, taste, sight. What did you see? What did you hear? Did your body feel in any particular way? So go ahead and spend some time recollecting, finding one that you want to work with, and then reliving it, and then representing it in some artistic or literary manner. All right. So I hope that was, helpful to you. This is the exercise we just did together. Could be done, of course, by yourself or with small groups of people. It's could be done on different kinds of experiences you've had, intuitive experiences, and so that you can sort of start developing your repertoire of intuition a little bit more fully. And I've had to do that. I mean, there are certain things I'm naturally good at. Movement. I was a gymnast as a teenager and a young person, so movement is easy for me. But some of the others not so much. Okay, so and that would probably be true for all of you. You're not going to be equally good at all of them. I mean, that just wouldn't make sense. And the other thing I wanted to say about forming groups, and since a lot of you are likely to be workshop leaders in the future, is that it's always helpful to have an intuition or a deep intuitive response recorded in some way, so that you have a record. The only way, the basic definition between research and not research, everything is that research is documented. That's the fundamental difference between everyday knowing and research. In research, you document everything. You're obsessive about documentation. So, but the record of an intuitive thing, because they're ineffable, is really important to record in a concrete way. And the other thing is often to also externalize it in conversation, if you have that opportunity. Again, that allows you probably learn something as you were talking about it as well, about your experience as well as learning from your colleagues. So there's something about the human being need to verbalize things. We're just a very social, talky people group, species, actually. You had a question?
Yes, so I was told that in a dissertation I'm not allowed to use the word I. So how do I include this qualitative research if I don't use I, talking about my own experience?
Well, I wouldn't give you that requirement. I would talk to your supervisor more. It's just that there are examples of dissertations in which I have many. Certainly all the ones that use intuitive inquiry, you could look them up. I'm going to put a list up in a little bit. And see how people have been able to bring both the third person and the first person together. It can be done well, but it takes more writing skill. It is not as easy as everything is third person, I used to have to refer to myself as he. That's how bad it was when in I know, it's hilarious. The experimenter, he. And I'm serious. That did resolve itself with the feminist movement in the early 70s. So I didn't have to do that for very long. But it was the norm at that time. I know it sounds really weird, but oh well. Okay, so I would like to talk a little bit more concretely now about different types of research. And transpersonal approaches to research can be used with numbers, with text, data, interviews, song lyrics, whatever it is, qualitative research, or mixed methods. So you can bring intuition. I mean, I do quantitative research still. I developed a body insight scale at one point, and I still look at numerical data. There's no reason not to look at numerical data. And when I look at the spreadsheets and I look at the data distribution, I use my intuitive response to help me understand the data. And I did this even 30 and 40 years ago, but I never told anybody. That was the difference. Now I can tell people that I use my intuition when I'm doing data analysis, numerical or textual. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So the first very broad type of research is quantitative research, and it has to do with usually doing an experiment pre and post. So there's an intervention in the middle, pre-intervention, post-test, pre-test, intervention, post-test. So you do a numerical assessment. It's on both sides of the treatment, and then you have a control group in which we have no treatment. So it's just pre-test, post-test, and then you look at the difference. That's the most basic form of experimental design. And if you haven't, you will hear a lot about that soon in your classes. Qualitative research has to do with words, various kinds of textual data. It could be interviews, it could be song lyrics, it could be sacred scripture, it could be mystical texts. There's a whole long list. It could be police records of accounts. Just anything that is words, or it could be images or stories. You could analyze fiction accounts of extraterrestrial. I don't know what you're going to research. But you could do trends. And I've for years tried to get somebody to do a dissertation or a research project on popular song lyrics in the United States since the 50s, to trace the evolution of spiritual trends and cultural trends in the United States. That would be a brilliant dissertation, and I hope somebody in this room does it, because I have failed for all these years to get anybody to do it. It would be a great way to document change through popular culture, And you'll think of Bob Dylan and all the stuff that went on in that era, the music, and now, and in the rock music. So it would be a great way to study spirituality historically around the world, but in the U.S. it's very obvious. Okay, and so you can obviously bring intuitive processes to qualitative a little bit more easily for most people, more congruently than quantitative, but the distinction is sort of moot. Depends on what you're naturally attuned to. I like numbers. I'm okay with the numbers. Some people aren't, and text is a little bit more congruent for some, but it is good to learn a little bit of both sides of this dynamic. And of course you can mix methods, both quantitative and qualitative. You can into a single study or a series of studies. That now is being called mixed methods approach to research, and there are lots of books out there on that. That's been going on for about the last 10 years formally, but frankly it's been around for as long as I've been a psychologist, for 40 years. I mean, if you look at, you can see it. It just wasn't called mixed methods. I use both quantitative and qualitative data in my research, in my dissertation research in 1973. But it didn't have this name. It was just a little bit more unusual, atypical. And then this is not something I usually recommend for dissertation students or thesis students, a theoretical inquiry in which you develop theory, formally, philosophic theory. The reason I don't recommend it is because it usually takes you about 10 years. And that's not practical for a dissertation for most people. It's a very time-consuming process. But it's a type of research that's very important to psychology in general. All right, these are the different types, the primary types of qualitative research. And I've just listed them, and more or less historically I've listed them. So you start with the one that got the most popularity or notoriety, depending on how you want to look at it, was phenomenology. That started in the 60s, primarily at Duquesne University in Pennsylvania. And so phenomenology is now a well-established qualitative research approach. It deals specifically with the detailed examination. Oh, I didn't put phenomenology at first. Sorry, I should have read my own screen. But phenomenology started in the late 60s. It involves a detailed examination of a phenomena. So usually you only have 3, 4, 5, 6 subjects, participants, and you get a very, very detailed examination of like a transpersonal experience of remote viewing, just to give you an example. And then you would analyze that with I mean, sometimes excruciatingly detailed. And then what you're looking for is common factors across, say, your 3 or 4 participants. It's extremely useful for certain topics, particularly topics that have not been explored before. And you need this level of detail to be able to talk about what the phenomenologists call the essential qualities of a particular phenomena, like remote viewing or sunyata, perception of emptiness. Those would be really good topics for phenomenology. Ethnography, which I put out in the first, was born not in psychology, but in anthropology. I learned, because my training was initially in experimental social psychology, we used a lot of ethnographic methods. We borrowed them from anthropology. Margaret Mead is probably the most famous anthropologist, and anthropology often studies places, exotic. She went to Samoa, but and studied the Samoans. But you could do it in your own neighborhood too, and examine people's responses to the Dalai Lama when he comes to town. I mean, it's just, that would be an example of using either ethnographic or naturalistic observations of people's responses to him. Does that make sense? So that's ethnographic. And all of these, qualitative methods, there's a lot of combinations and blending across these various modes at this point. Grounded theory was born in sociology, again in the 60s. Grounded theory is a very good method for developing what is called theory. Developing because you change your approach as you move forward. So there is a procedure within grounded theory that when you interview one person, you analyze the data for that one person, for one case. It could be like a song lyric. And then that changes your interview questions or the questions you ask of the second. Does that make sense? Or usually that's not the way research methods are designed. You usually have the same set of questions for each form of data, textual data. But in grounded theory, there's a very explicit procedure for that. Case study. very briefly, you would study an unusual disease as it manifested. There's a new virus going around. What is this called? I saw it in the newspaper. What? Yeah. So, studying the symptoms of an unusual virus at the outset of an outbreak, that would be an example of a case study in medicine. But in Freud, for example, did lots of case studies on his patients. That would be unethical now, by the way. You wouldn't get through the ethics committee because they were identifiable, those people, in his research. But they're long dead now. We don't have to worry about it. But that would be an example of case study. And then out of that case study, in his situation, a case like Anna, very famous client of his, Anna, you then extract understanding and theory. Whole theory came out of his basic, from a research point of view. He did case study analysis of his own clients and developed Freudian psychoanalysis out of that. So heuristic is a more contemporary method developed by a man by the name of Clark Moustakas. Clark Moustakas, who died only quite recently, was originally trained as a phenomenologist, and he then felt that the need to bring more personal insight into phenomenology, not just to keep the interviewee, the text, at a distance. So his first very famous study was a long study he did on loneliness, which was a real issue for him. So this is an example of through your own wounds. And he wrote a book, basically, talking about the experience of profound loneliness. It's a very, very moving book. And heuristic research then allows you to bring, it was really the first research method that brought in these kinds of approaches. And then feminist research, which I didn't list up there because feminist research tends to be sort of all over the place. I was very much involved in that movement in early years, but feminist research also brought a lot of personal insight and interaction, and it personalized the research environment and data gathering. More recently, we have art-based and narrative research methods, which I put together largely because I have to combine some of these things on a slide, but it comes out of art therapy and psychology, and so art-based is to collect art from your participants, literally have them draw like you did, or make mandalas, or a lot of ways you could collect artistic data from clients or participants. Well, I have tried. You can't do clients anymore. You can pressure ethics committee, but it's just you could collect artistic data. A method that I really like is called narrative methods. I like all of them actually, but the narrative usually helps a lot of my students, my supervisees over the years, because narrative research is based on storytelling. So instead of asking someone to describe what that experience was like, you ask them to tell the story of how this occurred, how this unfolded. And that little move, may sound like what's the big deal? But actually just that little move to ask the person to relay the story changes the entire environment. And so you have then data in the form of story. The trick with it is that data in the form of story is more difficult to analyze because it's not so codable. So there are procedures for doing it, but it is a little bit more challenging in that way. Artistic data is also more challenging to interpret. There's no question. There's a whole line of research now. Mostly it began in the UK and in Australia, in the field of organizational psychology is called action research. And it goes by a variety of different names: collaborative, appreciative, there's a whole bunch of names for it, a cluster of research. But it actually has to do with going into an organization or a community or a group or what, and working with them toward change, and then recording, documenting the course of change or lack of it that occurs in that context. But it's very engaged research. There's a whole bunch of names, that all have to do with engaging in an active way with the group you're studying. And last is my own method, which is called intuitive inquiry. It comes out of hermeneutics, which I explained before has to do with the process of interpretation. And with intuitive inquiry, there's often artistic data collection. You can use narrative processes. In fact, what I encourage students to do is to use the structure of intuitive inquiry, which has 5 distinct cycles. I'm not going to go through all of that today. Hopefully you can talk Olga into giving you a class on it. Okay? And excuse me while I so it has 5 cycles. The first cycle is to identify your topic. And in intuitive inquiry, we're going to do a very sort of brief exercise using intuitive inquiry, the first exercise in intuitive inquiry, which is to identify the passion that you want to study. And it's an exercise you can do over and over again until you nail it, so to speak, till you really figure out what is it that calls you at this point in your life, either in your professional life or in your research life or whatever it is. I just want to put a quick plug in for a book. What we do is we take one text, a woman with of a real person, that the phenomenologists knew well, and she was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of throat cancer. And and then her story, or her interview, was her story of treatment and recovery. And then using the 5 methods articulated up here, the phenomenology, grounded theory, we all analyze the same text in the book. So it's a very practical book. The problem with most research methods books is that they're really dry. And and they really are. I mean, I understand that, and but I don't think this one is so much, because what happens is you can follow how the phenomenologist understood her experience, and then you can look the grounded theorist, and the narrative researcher, and the intuitive research, and the analysis. There's a lot of commonality in terms of our findings and our interpretation, but there are very real distinct differences as well. So you can see in real life how these methods apply and work their way through. So of course I'm going to recommend it. This is just another photo I like to introduce this slide, but it is a stone heart, and it represents sculpture. It's a sculpture that, again, I found while I was walking on a lake shore. In this case, it wasn't a beach; it was a lake shore near Mount Shasta, and it just happened to be there, and I had my camera, and so I took a photo, and it represents for me that so many of the research topics in transpersonal psychology, not all, but so many of them come out of our personal passions and our vocations and the things to which we are uniquely called. In what I call the old days, we had to disguise all that. We had to find our topic in the history of the literature and then do the next obvious logical study to be done. That's what I had to do. You don't have to do that anymore in most graduate schools even, not just here. It can be done, and there's nothing wrong with doing it. So research topics evolve from the researcher's life experience and have heart and meaning to you. I don't think I have to explain that, right? Yeah, that's just pretty obvious. They involved reflective research processes, both interior and exterior. So there's a reflective, imaginal engagement with your data all the way through the study. Multiple ways of knowing, which Nancy alluded to, that you can use intuition of various types, for example, but you can also use just straight, traditional procedures. I have no objection to the traditional procedures. They just need help. They need augmentation. They're usually not enough to study transpersonal topics. Implicitly, transformational research or transpersonal research involves not only the transformation of yourself as the researcher, but also implicates the transformation of your research participants and anybody reading your study. So there is what I would call an extended audience. And I don't know that we'll have time today. I don't know. I never know how long it'll take me to talk about some of these things. But that your audience, who you are eventually directing your study, is a very important ingredient right from the beginning. This is radically different than what I was taught in graduate school. That nobody cared about an audience. We were just talking to each other. That's what researchers still do, actually. From my point of view, and increasingly throughout, certainly qualitative research and particularly human science research in medicine and counseling and nursing. The nurses really have a lot of good research. Boy, they've moved much faster than doctors, much. It's very interesting to me. So nursing research is very involved with, okay, how does this healing practice or how does this phenomena relate to the person suffering with cancer or whatever it might be? Does that all make sense? Yeah, it's very, so you design your research study with your future audience in mind. You're not just talking to other scientists, which was the traditional training. Incorporate spiritual values in the context of research like compassion and mindfulness. I mean, I don't need to explain that to you. It's just that the way you treat your participants, the way you treat your colleagues is important, that's all. And finally, and the most important, is the active engagement that the research is an encounter with the sacred. Research is an encounter with the sacred. If you have that spiritual value, I mean, not everybody does, obviously. But if you have a value which is probably well shared in this community, that what you want to study is for you an engagement with the sacred, that changes your orientation towards your research project. It becomes an art of transformation. That's the other language I've been using for yourself, for others, and potentially, hopefully, for your future audience in whatever form it takes, workshops, books, dissertation. Not too many people read dissertations, so you might want to think a little broader, but or theses for that matter. But it's just to think about the encounter with the sacred. This is very much a part of my work and how I think about it.